Stanford University.
Hello, my name is Juliet Brodie. I'm a professor at Stanford Law School and director of the Stanford Community Law Clinic, which is located a few miles off campus in East Palo Alto. I've just finished a casebook for teaching a class at law schools in poverty law, and that's what we're hoping to talk about today. Welcome to Open Office Hours. So as director of the Stanford Community Law Clinic, what I spend most of my time doing is supervising law students who are representing real people in real cases here in East Palo Alto. We represent poor people, low-income people in the communities surrounding the law school in a wide range of civil poverty law cases. I say civil, that is, we're not public defenders. We don't do criminal law cases. We do a lot of housing work. We do a lot of public benefits work and a whole bunch of other things that we think will help, that both teach law students how to be lawyers and provide services to the low-income neighbors of the community. So an example of the kind of cases that we work on here are eviction cases, where someone who lives here in East Palo Alto either fell behind in their rent or did something that their landlord thinks violates their lease, and their landlord starts an eviction case against them. And we're one of the very few offices in the community where those tenants can get free, full legal representation in those cases in court. There are actually a lot of defenses that tenants have to eviction, and without a lawyer, most of those defenses can't be asserted. So we try and publicize our services and help as many of the tenants as we can to educate them about their rights and, if possible, to become their lawyer and actually represent them in court. It's also a great opportunity for students to see how the abstract landlord-tenant law that they may have learned on the books actually plays out in a real courtroom with a real client. One of the striking things about American society is really profound segregation, not only by race, but also by income. And one of the things that we find so important about this work is that it provides a place for people who are getting an elite education to come into daily contact with low-income people and to break down some of that segregation. One of the reasons that the colleagues with whom I wrote this book and I wanted to do the book is we really wanted to revive the subject of poverty law in law school curriculums. It's been over 15 years since anyone has written a book for law professors to teach the subject of poverty law. And a lot has happened in the past 15 years, and we wanted to reintroduce the poverty law subjects into the curriculum and make it easier for our colleagues around the country to teach the class. Not every law student can do a poverty law clinic or represent low-income people in a real setting like this one, and we wanted them to be able to study poverty law in the classroom as well. This book covers a wide range of areas, all under the umbrella of poverty law. It starts out by defining how does U.S. law define poverty? What are alternative ways to think about poverty? There are chapters on the Constitution and poverty. Do poor people have constitutional rights? Then we go into subject areas that are important to poor people and that the federal government has typically tried to involve itself in. So, for example, the always important subject when you're talking about American poverty of welfare and welfare reform. What has the federal government done about welfare? What's worked? What hasn't worked? There's chapters in the book about that. But as well, there's information in the book about housing programs, about health care, about education, about major areas of life and how are poor people affected by them, from what aspects of our common culture are poor people excluded, and how has law tried to bridge some of those gaps. We got a question on Facebook about how low-income people can feel trust in the institutions that are set up to serve them. And it's a really great question Because one of the things that poor people face is vulnerabilities that middle-class people might not even ever think about. The thing that comes to my mind immediately is representing people who are undocumented immigrants. How can we convey to them that it's safe for them to come to a law office, to the legal system at all, if, for example, they have a right that they think has been violated? We've had experiences with undocumented immigrants who come from countries and they tell us that in their home country, lawyers are allied with the government. Lawyers are not on their side, but they're part of the system. And it's a real challenge for us to educate those kinds of clients that in the United States, their secrets are safe with their attorney. The one thing we can promise them is we won't tell their secrets. There are, of course, a few exceptions, but they rarely come up. And that in general, it's very safe for a poor person to come and see whether they have a problem that a lawyer could help them with. I think the same is probably true in other disciplines. You have to be very transparent and honest about what you can and cannot protect your client or your patient from. And in the legal system, we're really lucky to have a very sacred attorney-client privilege that allows us to protect the secrets of our clients. We try and communicate that to people in the community, that even if they come to us for help, if they decide that asserting a right or taking a position in a lawsuit is something that just feels too vulnerable to them, that's their decision. And we will never divulge anything that they've told us unless it's something strategically that they want us to do. So we also got a question about how can the law help empower people to solve their own problems? One of the things we know about the American legal system is there are not enough lawyers to go around to poor people in the US. In fact, there's approximately one lawyer for every 7,000 eligible low-income people in the US, where there's about 1 in 500 lawyers, for every 500 people who would not be eligible for legal aid. So there just are not enough lawyers to go around. It means that one of the things lawyers have to do is think about ways to empower low-income people to represent themselves, solve their own problems in the legal system. It's one of the things that the book talks a lot about is self-help, what creative strategies have lawyers and other advocates tried in various contexts so that not everyone needs a lawyer. An example, again, is in the eviction context. It would be great if everyone could have a lawyer, a champion by their side. But if you can't, let's develop materials that explain some of those defenses that we talked about, that tell a tenant how to prove her own case, how to get a witness to come to court, what is reasonable to ask for in a settlement. We have to leverage the few legal resources that we have so that the majority of tenants who won't have a lawyer are able to advance their own rights as well. So another question that we got has to do with encouraging law students to go into poverty law. And it's a real challenge. I'm not going to kid anybody. The legal profession, like other professions, rewards financially people who represent big business, big corporations. That's where the money is. To make a living as a lawyer for poor people is a lot more challenging. I can't encourage students to do it if what they want is to get rich. And students who go to law schools like Stanford, but really all kinds of lawyers have access to pretty high-powered and high-paying jobs. One of the things that every lawyer has to think about is what, if any, responsibility does that lawyer have to our justice system overall? And is there a responsibility to represent poor people as at least a part of your professional commitment? A lot of lawyers do it through private pro bono. They will handle a handful of cases for free for poor people during the year. Others contribute financially. But there are, and we do need more lawyers who literally commit their career to legal aid and to representing poor people in civil cases. How can I encourage students to do that? I can say, if you're the kind of person who wants your values and your professional life to be aligned, maybe a career in civil legal services or in public defense or in some other arena of social justice law is going to be more satisfying to you in the long run than the big dollars that you might earn in another job. It's a real privilege to be a lawyer. We have access and a monopoly on the ability to represent people in court. And to do so for people who otherwise wouldn't have a voice is, for some of us, nothing short of thrilling. And it's why we went to law school. I feel sometimes nervous giving this advice because I have a position of incredible privilege, being able to be a professor at Stanford and teach about these issues, and I haven't had to face my own financial sacrifice the way I see some of my students going off to do. And so I try to be humble and mindful about that, but to encourage them, if they have the spark that they went to law school because they wanted to help solve the poverty problem in the US, to keep their eyes on that light and keep that spark glowing, because they won't be sorry. So another question that someone asked on the Facebook page had to do with poverty and stigma. And this is a really important issue in American poverty law. The question had to do with if one of the things you do to help people in poverty is to provide certain benefits. Things come to mind like cash assistance, that's welfare, or food stamps, or a housing subsidy. Does it matter if receiving those benefits is visible to the people around them? An example that gets used a lot is free or reduced lunch at school. And should we have two different lines in the lunchroom? One for the regular kids and one for the free or reduced cost lunch kids. No one wants to see poor kids lined up in a different line in the lunchroom. And similarly, there could be stigma associated with any time you know that someone is in the economy using something that they got from the government to pay for something that their neighbor uses their own money to pay for. How to resolve this problem is not easy. There used to be something called food stamps. We still have a food stamp program. Now it's called Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. And usage, by the way, has gone up through the roof since the recession in 2008. Food stamps used to be literal stamps, like a currency that you would see people have on the grocery line. Now, food stamps are delivered on an electronic benefit card, so it looks much more like a credit card or a debit card. And that gets loaded with the family's benefit amount automatically. Part of the reason for transitioning to the card was to reduce the stigma. On the other hand, it's important to ask, what does it mean in our society that it's so stigmatizing to need help in making ends meet? I think that really goes to one of the most important questions in poverty law and poverty in general in the US, which is, how do we as a community, as a culture, as a society, tend to look at poor people around us? There's two dominant ways, and it's a real conflict in our society. Some blame the poor and say the reason that someone may be using food stamps on the grocery line is because of bad choices that they've made. Some failure of work ethic, some inability to make good choices that land them in an economically self-sustaining position. And we blame the poor for their poverty. Others are much more inclined to look at social barriers to upward mobility and to look at things like wage stagnation, look at enduring race discrimination in hiring. Look at all kinds of social factors having mostly, in my opinion, to do with wages and income inequality that as the causes of people's poverty. Is there one cause for everyone's poverty? Of course not. Do some poor people make terrible choices? Of course. So do middle class people. So do wealthy people. Good judgment. No socioeconomic class has a monopoly on bad judgment. But I think the conflict of what do you really think causes poverty is really one of the most enduring and important questions when you look at what should we do to eliminate poverty. If you think poverty is caused by poor people's bad choices, you're going to prescribe all kinds of very strict, what I would consider harsh, punitive measures to school them into making better choices. This is the spirit that animated welfare reform in the 90s, that welfare, cash assistance, was causing poverty, not helping poverty, but causing it by increasing people's dependency. Well, if I can get welfare, why would I even look for a job? If that's what you think is going on, ending welfare makes sense. Those of us who don't think that poverty is caused by poor people's bad choices or laziness or lack of interest in self-sustaining wage work, who think that something else is going on, will look to other kinds of solutions. Economic policy, wage support, increasing the safety net, and by going along with that, working to eliminate the social stigma associated with using the safety net. Another way to think about some of these issues is, no matter what kind of law you practice, how are poor people and the issues of poverty going to be relevant to you professionally and personally? And one thing I always tell my students is no matter what kind of lawyer they're going to be, even if they go on to be lawyers to the biggest corporations in America and in the world, somewhere down that economic stream of the deals and the cases that they're working on are real people working on an assembly line, perhaps, in India, putting together the electronic devices that are now the subject of the litigation. There's real people living in the neighborhoods that are affected by the environmental and product liability cases that they're going to be working on. And studying poverty law and understanding a sense of how U.S. wages line up with CEO wages, understanding how welfare policy affects real people, who's eligible for food stamps. It's going to be, I think, useful to them in staying grounded as they work on even cases that don't seem to be affecting those segments of the population. The other reason is just personally. As we were talking about earlier, our residential segregation and educational segregation are so profound that if I really think it's important for students to take advantage, at least while they're in the university setting, to really explore a more complex American society than they may do once they're out in the world. And again, so that when they go to a hotel and they travel on business, they have a little context to think about the people who clean their hotel rooms. They think a little bit about the busboys in the restaurants. Wonder what's happening with their wages. Are they eligible for certain benefits? Are they stigmatized when they seek assistance from the safety net? How would we prevent that? I think as lawyers, we have a unique obligation to something called justice. And that obligation will be served by exposing yourself to these issues, not just while you're in law school, but certainly while you're there. So one thing that students often want to learn about is how does the poverty situation in the United States compare to how poverty is treated in other societies and internationally. And one of the things that students are often surprised to learn is that U.S. law really doesn't provide very much affirmative rights to very many affirmative things. So The United States Constitution is written in negative terms. The government shall pass no law abridging. Equal protection of the law shall not be denied. The affirmative things that you're entitled to, even the grandest, like due process of law, aren't very specific. You don't have a right in American law to housing, or a right to food, or subsistence income. These things are not rights, either by statute or by the United States Constitution. Throughout its history, and most particularly, we are celebrating right now the 50th anniversary of the so-called War on Poverty, which some have described better as a skirmish than a war. We certainly haven't won the War on Poverty. But what the War on Poverty in the mid-60s was about was seeking to establish some of these rights, either through litigation under the United States Constitution or through statutes. Didn't meet with a whole lot of success. In some other societies, including Western industrialized societies, there are more rights than there are here in the U.S. The South African Constitution actually enshrines a right to housing within it. Now, how that gets effectuated and how you actually deliver on a right to housing in a complex industrial economy is not clear, but the U.S. law is very skimpy on affirmative rights that poor people could seek to enforce. One thing that people were asking about on Facebook was how many people in the U.S. are poor, and what do we mean by poor when we talk about it in the U.S.? What we know today as the federal poverty line was established in the mid-60s by the federal government based on a certain basket of food and the assumption that American families were spending 33% of their income on food. And every single year, the federal government releases figures of how many people by their income fall below that federal poverty line. And it's something anyone who's interested can find really easily on the internet at the Census Bureau's website. But the current poverty rate, that is the number of people, the percentage of Americans who live below the poverty line right now is 15%, which is quite high if you think about it. It's higher than it has been. It's been rising, unsurprisingly, since the recession, unchanged the past year or two. People say that if we had a more realistic poverty line, the poverty rate would actually be much, much higher. So 15% for some people consider it to undercount people who really live in economic hardship in the U.S. with food insecurity, for example. The other thing that shouldn't surprise anyone is that that 15% is not distributed equally across the population. People of color, children, live in much higher rates of poverty than the general population. Fully 27% of African Americans in the United States live below the official poverty line. 1 in 5 children in the U.S. lives below the official poverty line. If we were to adjust that for what some consider a more realistic actual line of hardship, the numbers would be much higher. So poverty is a much more real problem in the United States than some people would like to believe. People sometimes ask me, is there cause for hope? Can lawyers and law be a part of a movement for social justice for poor people in the United States? And I say, of course, even though I don't know exactly how. I look back at my parents' generation growing up when the War on Poverty itself was in the headlines every day, and there were marches on Washington of poor people. Civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, had hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C. protesting the way income was distributed, the way people of color were kept out of mainstream society and employment and housing. We certainly don't see any kind of mass movement like that today, even though some of the numbers about income inequality and how the poor are staying poor and getting poorer compared to the rich are utterly alarming for people who are concerned about the future of our democracy. I don't know what the next great social movement is going to be, but I certainly hope it's out there. And I want to be helping to prepare lawyers to participate in that movement, to do every single thing they can think of to push the law in a way that will protect the real people that law affects every day, whether it's in employment, in criminal justice, in the right to sustainable income. I just hope that lawyers will remember their commitment to justice and to being part of whatever movement is going to help solve these great problems that I think we're still facing. Another question people ask me is, how do you take a diverse group of Stanford law students or Stanford poverty law students who themselves come from a wide range of backgrounds and get them all on the same page to understand some of the challenges that their clients are going to face? One of the things that we do out here in the Community Law Clinic, and I would encourage anyone who's teaching or interested in poverty law to do, is to come up with some form of budget exercise that lets students really figure out on their own how much does it cost to live in any given community. We can do it here in East Palo Alto, you could do it in Palo Alto, any of the surrounding communities of the university or of any community in the United States. And try and figure out how much would it cost, say, a single mom with 2 kids to live in that community. What do rents cost? How much do people spend on food? How much do people spend on their cell phone plan? How much do people spend on transportation in a given community? And what is reasonable to assume that a single mom with 2 kids would spend? Then they have this number of their monthly expenses for this family. We ask them then to reverse engineer that number and figure out how much per hour would that mom need to earn to support that budget on a monthly basis. It's also taking into account childcare, which is one of the most expensive things in any working family's budget. How much does this mom need to earn? And students will do the math really on the back of a napkin right there in class, and they'll see that the number is often as high as $25, $35 an hour. When they compare that to the U.S. minimum wage of $8, of the California minimum wage presently of $8 an hour, the federal minimum wage is lower than that, and they compare it to the wages that their actual clients are earning, usually in the ballpark of 8 to 10, sometimes as high as $15 per hour, but dramatically lower than what their even most conservative family budget generates. When we're in the clinical context, that is when we're out here in East Palo Alto practicing law, but in the poverty law classroom as well, you can quickly see how that gap between what it costs to live and what a low-wage worker is earning, you can quickly see how legal issues are going to arise. This is how people fall behind on rent. One car accident, one brake failure that requires a couple $100 to the mechanic, and suddenly you don't have the money to make rent. Now the students understand the margin on which working people are living in this community or really in any community in the United States, and they'll see why lawyers helping people solve these problems are so important. Because without that margin and with wage levels the way they are, working people, low-income, poor people are so vulnerable, not only economically but legally.
Stanford University.